Hello. Whether you're settling into bed, winding down from the day, or simply letting your mind rest for a while, take a moment to slow down. This is Sleepless Veteran, military history for quiet minds. Here, we don't dramatize. We remember. We walk through history together, slowly and carefully. Tonight, we're going to the skies over Europe, to the Second World War, to the American strategic bombing campaign against Germany, to the men who flew in the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the bomber that became the symbol of American air power, the aircraft that carried 10-man crews on missions that lasted 8 hours, 10 hours, into the heart of German defenses. This is a story about altitude, about cold, about young men, mostly in their early 20s, some barely 19, who climbed into unpressurized bombers and flew to 25,000 feet. About what that altitude meant, what it required, what it cost. About the environment inside the aircraft that was as dangerous as the enemy outside. About flak and fighters. About systems that had to work perfectly because failure meant death. About missions repeated 25 times, 30 times, 35 times. About statistics that said most wouldn't complete their tours. We're not here to glorify war or to make combat seem heroic in simple ways. Just to understand what these young men experienced. What it meant to strap into a B-17, to fly through flak fields, to watch other bombers fall, to endure cold that could kill, to breathe through a mask for 8 hours because the air outside was too thin to sustain life. So find a comfortable position. Let your breathing settle. What follows is a story about endurance, about fear that was rational because you watched men die, about the mathematics of probability over time, about 10 crew members whose survival depended entirely on each other, about the missions that continued regardless of casualties, about what it cost to fly in the Flying Fortress. Stay calm, stay present. Let's walk through this history together. Now, let's go to England, to an air base, to the early morning briefing room, to the beginning of a mission that will last all day, to the moment when crews learned where they were going, what they would face, whether they would return. The wake-up call came early. 0400, 4 in the morning, still dark outside, cold. The barracks were basic, rows of bunks. Men stirred, dressed quickly. The operations officer had come through earlier, tapping certain men on the shoulder. Your crew is flying today. Get up, report to briefing. Not every crew flew every day. The aircraft needed maintenance, the crews needed rest. But missions came frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple days in succession. When your name was on the list, you flew. The selection was rotation mostly, ensuring that all crews accumulated missions at roughly the same pace. The goal was for everyone to reach 25 missions, the original tour length, at approximately the same time, though few would actually make it that far intact. Breakfast was available, but many couldn't eat. Anxiety prevented appetite. The knowledge of what was coming made food unappealing. Some men forced themselves to eat anyway, understood that they'd need energy for the mission ahead. Others drank coffee. Strong, hot, the caffeine and warmth more important than food. The briefing room filled around 0500, rows of chairs facing a wall covered by a curtain. Behind the curtain was a map. The map showed the route, the target, the expected defenses. The crews filed in, found seats. The room filled with quiet conversation. Speculation about where they were going, what the target would be, how heavily defended. The veterans could often guess by the level of tension among the officers, by small tells that indicated deep penetration or heavily defended targets. The briefing began when the commanding officer entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The curtain was pulled back, the map revealed. A line drawn from England across the Channel, across France or Belgium or the Netherlands, deep into Germany. The target marked. Sometimes it was an aircraft factory, sometimes ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, transportation hubs. Each target was critical to German war production. Each was defended by flak and fighters. The intelligence officer spoke first. Described the target, why it mattered, what was known about defenses, the flak concentrations, expected fighter activity, Luftwaffe bases nearby, the known locations of anti-aircraft batteries. The information was detailed, but often incomplete. Intelligence was imperfect. Defenses changed. Sometimes the reality exceeded the briefing. Sometimes it was better than expected. Usually it was worse. The route was explained. The altitude. 25,000 feet typically, sometimes higher. The assembly point where individual bombers would form up into the combat box formation. The initial point where the bomb run would begin. The timing, when to start engines, when to taxi, when to take off. The entire sequence coordinated across dozens of aircraft. Hundreds sometimes, depending on the size of the operation. Weather was briefed. Expected conditions over the channel. Over the continent. Over the target. Cloud cover. Visibility. Wind. Weather at altitude was always cold. Always challenging. But thick clouds could provide cover from fighters. Clear skies made bombing more accurate, but also made the formation more visible. More vulnerable. The expected duration was announced. 8 hours, 10 hours, depending on target distance. The number hung in the air. 8 hours at altitude. 8 hours in the cold. 8 hours breathing through an oxygen mask. 8 hours of sustained vigilance. The endurance required was substantial, not a momentary peak of intensity, but hours of it. Then came the crew assignments. Which aircraft? Which position in the formation? Lead aircraft had specific responsibilities. Wing aircraft protected the flanks. Each position in the formation had its purpose, its role in mutual defense. Being assigned to a particular position meant specific expectations, specific vulnerabilities. The crews were young. Looking around the briefing room, you saw men mostly in their early 20s, some 19, 20. A few older, perhaps 25 or 26, seeming ancient by comparison. Officers and enlisted mixed. Pilots and co-pilots were officers. Bombardiers and navigators were officers. The other 6 crew positions were enlisted. But in the air, rank mattered less than role. Then competence. Then everyone doing their job because survival depended on it. These men came from everywhere. Small towns, large cities, farms, different regions, different backgrounds, thrown together in crews during training, bonded through shared experience, through dependence. The pilot in the left seat might be from Oregon, the bombardier from New York, the waist gunner from Texas, the ball turret gunner from Ohio. Geography didn't matter. The crew was what mattered. The 10 men who would spend the next 8 hours together in a metal tube at altitude under fire. The statistics weren't explicitly stated during briefings, but everyone knew them. During the worst periods in 1943, before long-range fighter escorts became available, the loss rates on some missions exceeded 20%. 20%. 1 in 5 aircraft didn't return. Each aircraft held 10 men. The mathematics was simple and brutal. Completing a tour of 25 missions during this period was statistically unlikely. Only about 1 in 4 crews completed tours intact. The tour length had been 25 missions initially. Later, it was increased to 30, then 35. The increase meant more exposure, more missions, more probability of being hit, of being killed. The men in the briefing room knew this, understood that the odds were against them, that skill mattered, but so did luck, that you could do everything right and still die because a flak shell exploded nearby, because a fighter's cannon round hit a critical system, because an oxygen hose froze, because of factors beyond control. Yet they continued, prepared for the mission, listened to the briefing, asked questions about the route or the target or the weather, made notes, checked details. The discipline and professionalism were remarkable given the knowledge they carried. The fear was present but controlled, managed, pushed aside to focus on the immediate task, on the mission that needed flying regardless of the odds. The briefing concluded with timing. Synchronize watches. Start engines at this time. Taxi at this time. Take off at this time. Everything coordinated, precise. The assembly of dozens or hundreds of aircraft into formations required timing down to the minute. Any delay cascaded through the system, created problems for everyone. Dismissed. The crews stood, filed out, headed to the equipment room to collect gear. The briefing was complete. The mission parameters were known. The target was set. Now came the preparation, the physical act of getting ready, of putting on the equipment that would allow survival at altitude, that would provide protection, however minimal, from cold and lack of oxygen and enemy fire. The equipment room held racks of gear, flight suits, leather jackets, heated suits with wires throughout, oxygen masks, parachutes, Mae West life vests in case of ditching over water. Each crew member collected their gear, checked it, ensured everything was present and functional. The heated suits were checked carefully, wires intact, connections secure. The suits were essential. At 60 below zero, a failed heating suit meant frostbite within minutes, meant potentially fatal cold exposure. The walk to the aircraft was quiet. Some crews talked, nervous conversation, jokes. Banter that was forced but served a purpose, broke tension, maintained morale. Other crews were silent, each man alone with thoughts, with fear, with the knowledge of what was coming. The aircraft waited on the hard stand. The B-17 Flying Fortress, large, 4 engines, defensive guns visible. The bomber that would be home for the next 8 hours. The metal shell that provided minimal protection but was all they had. The crew approached their aircraft, their assigned bomber. Some aircraft had names, painted on the nose. Some had nose art, images of women, symbols. Each aircraft developed personality through missions, through survival. The crew developed attachment to their aircraft, belief that their particular bomber was lucky, was solid, would bring them home. The attachment was irrational perhaps, but psychologically important. The mission was beginning. The briefing was complete. The crew was assembled. The aircraft waited. In minutes, the engines would start. The bomber would taxi, would take off, would climb to altitude. The mission would truly begin, and there would be no turning back until landing 8 hours later, or until something went wrong. Until the mission ended in ways other than safe return. The possibilities were known, were understood, were accepted because there was no choice. The mission required flying. The war required missions, so the crews flew, knowing the odds, knowing the danger, knowing that this mission, like every mission, might be the last. The B-17 Flying Fortress was large for its era. Wingspan 103 feet, length 74 feet, height 19 feet. Standing next to it on the hard stand, the aircraft dominated. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines. Each engine had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. Each engine produced over 1,000 horsepower. The sound when all 4 engines ran at full power was extraordinary. Physical, felt in the chest. The crew split up for pre-flight checks. Each member had specific responsibilities. The pilots walked around the aircraft. Visual inspection, looking for obvious damage, for leaks, for anything wrong. The control surfaces were checked. Ailerons, elevators, rudder, moved by hand to ensure free movement. No binding, no damage from previous missions that might have gone unnoticed. The flight engineer focused on engines and systems, checked oil levels, checked hydraulic fluid, looked for leaks, for damage, for wear. The engines were critical, 4 of them. Redundancy was built in. The bomber could fly on 3 engines, could theoretically fly on 2, though altitude would suffer. But 4 engines running properly was the goal. The engineer's job was ensuring everything mechanical was ready. The bombardier and navigator entered through the nose hatch, crawled into the plexiglass nose section, checked their equipment, the Norden bomb sight, the navigation instruments, the forward firing guns. Everything had to be ready, had to function. The nose was cramped. 2 men in a small space, surrounded by plexiglass. The visibility was excellent. The protection was none. The plexiglass stopped wind, but not bullets, not shrapnel. The gunners checked their weapons. The ball turret gunner inspected the turret mechanism, the sphere that hung beneath the fuselage. The turret could rotate 360 degrees, could elevate and depress. 2 50-caliber machine guns. The gunner would enter once airborne. For now, just inspection, ensuring the turret moved freely, that the guns were ready, that ammunition was loaded. The waist gunners checked their positions, the open windows on either side of the rear fuselage. Each window had a single 50-caliber machine gun on a flexible mount. The ammunition was belt-fed, thousands of rounds stored in cans. The guns had to traverse smoothly, had to elevate and depress without binding. The waist gunners would stand at these positions for the entire mission. 8 hours, 10 hours, standing at open windows with wind rushing through at 200 miles per hour. The tail gunner crawled through the fuselage to the tail section, sat in his position, faced backward. 2 50-caliber guns. The tail was the most common attack angle for fighters. The tail gunner's position was critical for defense, but it was isolated, cramped. The gunner couldn't leave during flight, couldn't move, just sat, watched, waited. The pre-flight took 30 minutes perhaps, everyone checking their areas, their equipment, their responsibilities. When complete, the crew gathered near the aircraft, waited for the signal, for the flare that indicated time to start engines. The waiting was tense. The mission was imminent, the point of no return approaching. The flare went up. Time. The pilots climbed into the cockpit. The rest of the crew boarded through the rear hatch. Each member moved to their position, strapped in, connected oxygen hoses, tested intercom connections. The checklist was methodical, every item checked, every system verified. The discipline was essential. Skipping steps could be fatal. Engine start sequence began. The number 3 engine first. The right inboard engine. The starter engaged. The engine turned over, coughed, caught. The radial engine came to life. Smoke from the exhaust. The distinctive sound. Deep, rough, powerful. Then number 4, the right outboard. Then number 2, the left inboard. Finally number 1. The left outboard. All 4 engines running. The noise was tremendous. 4 radial engines at idle. The sound filled the air, made speech impossible without the intercom. The pilot checked instruments, oil pressure, fuel flow, engine temperature, hydraulics. Everything had to be in the green, had to be normal. If anything was wrong, if any system showed problems, the mission couldn't continue. The aircraft would abort. Another crew would take its place. But if everything checked good, the mission proceeded. Radio check. Each crew member called in over the intercom. Confirmed they could hear and be heard. Communication was essential. The pilot needed to know what was happening throughout the aircraft. The gunners needed to report enemy fighters. The engineer needed to report system status. The intercom made coordination possible. Taxi clearance came. The bomber moved. Slowly. Taxiing a B-17 required care. The aircraft was heavy, over 30 tons empty, with fuel and bombs over 50 tons. The tailwheel steering was sensitive. Too much brake on one side and the aircraft would ground loop. The taxi to the runway was deliberate, following the aircraft ahead. Part of a line of bombers moving towards a takeoff. The runway wait varied, sometimes brief, sometimes extended if problems developed with earlier aircraft. The crew waited, engines running, systems checked, ready, the tension building, the point of commitment approaching. Once takeoff began, the mission was truly underway. There would be no casual return to base, no simple change of plans. The mission would continue until completed or until circumstances made continuation impossible. Takeoff clearance. The pilot advanced the throttles, all 4 engines to full power. The sound was overwhelming. The bomber accelerated, slowly at first, the weight fighting the engines, but speed built, 50 miles per hour, 60, 70. The tail came up, the aircraft leveled, still accelerating, 80 miles per hour, 90, then rotation. The pilot pulled back on the yoke. The bomber lifted off, the main wheels left the runway. The aircraft climbed. The mission had begun. The gear retracted, hydraulics whining, the wheels folding into the nacelles. The aircraft accelerated slightly without the drag. Flaps came up, incrementally. Too fast and the aircraft would stall. The climb was gradual. The bomber was heavy, fuel tanks full, bomb bay loaded. The climb rate was modest, perhaps 500 feet per minute, less when fully loaded. The English countryside passed below. Green, patchwork of fields, villages, roads. The contrast with what was coming was stark. England was safe, peaceful from the air. In an hour, the view would be different, would be hostile territory, enemy defenses. But for now, just the climb, just the assembly. The assembly point was predetermined, a specific location where individual bombers would form up into the combat box formation. The formation provided mutual defensive fire, guns from multiple aircraft covering each other. Isolated bombers were vulnerable, easy targets for fighters. The formation was protection, was survival. The bombers circled the assembly point, gradually formed up. Lead aircraft in the center, wing aircraft on the flanks, high and low elements, the three-dimensional structure that provided overlapping fields of fire. The assembly took time, coordination, radio calls, visual references, but eventually the formation was complete. The combat box assembled, the heading set, the course toward the enemy. The channel crossing was uneventful usually. The water below was gray, cold. If the aircraft ditched, survival time was minutes. The May West vests provided flotation. Rafts were aboard. But the cold water was deadly. Everyone knew this. Hoped it wouldn't come to that. Hoped the engines kept running. Hoped the aircraft held together. The coast of occupied Europe appeared. France or Belgium or the Netherlands, depending on the route. The landscape changed. Still green, but no longer friendly. Now overflown enemy territory. Now in range of enemy defenses. The mission's dangerous phase beginning. The crew's vigilance increased. The gunners scanning for fighters. The pilot maintaining position. Everyone alert. Everyone ready. The approach to the target had begun. The bomber continued climbing after the formation assembled. The operational altitude was 25,000 feet typically, sometimes higher. The altitude provided some protection from flak, made interception by fighters more difficult. But it also created an environment hostile to human life. An environment that required constant vigilance and perfectly functioning systems. At 10,000 feet, the order came over the intercom. Oxygen masks on. Every crew member donned their mask, secured the straps, checked the seal, connected the hose to the oxygen system, tested the flow. The oxygen was pure. Breathed through a regulator that adjusted flow based on altitude. At 10,000 feet, supplemental oxygen was necessary. Above 15,000, it was critical. Above 20,000, unconsciousness occurred within minutes without it. The temperature dropped as the bomber climbed. Ground level might be 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, but manageable. At 10,000 feet, it was near freezing. At 15,000, below zero. At 20,000, 20 below. At 25,000, the operational altitude, the outside temperature reached 40 to 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The cold was absolute, penetrating, life-threatening. The crew wore layers, wool underwear, flight suits, leather jackets. Over everything, the heated suits. The suits had wires woven throughout, connected to the aircraft electrical system. When functioning, the suits provided adequate warmth, kept core temperature stable, kept extremities warm enough to function, but the suits were not perfectly reliable. Wires could break, connections could fail. When a heated suit failed at altitude, the crew member had minutes to recognize the problem and fix it. If not fixed, frostbite occurred rapidly. Fingers, toes, ears, face. The injuries were painful and permanent. The air pressure decreased with altitude. At sea level, air pressure is approximately 15 pounds per square inch. At 25,000 feet, it drops to roughly 5 pounds per square inch. 1/3 the pressure. The oxygen content decreases proportionally. At this pressure, the human body cannot extract enough oxygen from ambient air to maintain consciousness. The oxygen mask and system were not convenience. They were life support, absolutely essential. Without them, death was certain. The bomber was unpressurized. The interior pressure was the same as outside. At 25,000 feet, this meant 5 pounds per square inch inside the aircraft. The crew's bodies experienced this low pressure constantly for the duration of the mission. 8 hours, 10 hours. The physical effects were significant. Ears had to equalize. Sinuses adjusted. The body worked harder to maintain function. Fatigue set in more quickly. Cognitive function decreased slightly. Everything was harder at altitude. The formation continued climbing. Individual bombers maintaining position. The combat box holding shape. The altitude increased. 15,000 feet, 20,000. The temperature continued dropping. The cold became a presence, a constant factor in every calculation, in every action. At 25,000 feet, the climb ended. The formation leveled off. This was the operational altitude. The altitude they would maintain for hours. The altitude where the mission would be flown. The environment was now fully hostile. 60 below zero. Air pressure 1/3 of normal. Every breath through the oxygen mask. Every movement in the bulky, heated suit. The endurance test had begun. The crew settled into their positions for the long flight to target. The pilots flew the aircraft, maintained position in formation, small adjustments to throttle and control. Constant attention. The co-pilot monitored instruments, fuel flow, engine temperature, oil pressure, hydraulics. Everything had to remain normal. Any deviation required immediate attention. The bombardier and navigator in the nose continued their work. The navigator calculated position, checked maps, verified the course, ensured the formation was on track to the target. The bombardier prepared the Norden bomb sight, the sophisticated device that would allow precision bombing, checked settings, verified functionality. The bomb run was hours away, but preparation began early. The flight engineer monitored engines, 4 engines running smoothly. The sound was constant, overwhelming, but the engineer listened for changes, for anything that indicated problems, for any deviation from normal operation, managed fuel consumption, transferred fuel between tanks to maintain balance, kept the center of gravity proper. The radio operator maintained communications, listened to frequencies, passed information to the pilots, monitored for updates, for changes to the mission, for warnings of increased enemy activity. The radio was linked to command, to other formations, to the broader operation. The gunners watched for fighters. The ball turret gunner had entered his position after takeoff, squeezed through the fuselage into the small sphere, assumed the fetal position necessary to fit, rotated the turret into position. Now he hung beneath the aircraft, scanning below and to the sides. 2 50 caliber guns ready. The position was cramped beyond description. Impossible to move, impossible to stretch. Just the fetal position for hours. The waist gunners stood at their positions. The open windows. The wind rushed through at the aircraft's speed. 200 miles per hour. The wind chill was extreme. 60 below zero temperature. 200 mile per hour wind. The effective temperature was far below anything measured on any thermometer. The waist gunners wore all available protection, multiple layers, heated suits, heavy gloves, face protection, but the cold, penetrated, was inescapable. They stood at these positions for the entire mission, hours of standing in wind and cold that would kill an unprotected person within minutes. The tail gunner sat facing backward, alone at the rear of the aircraft. The position was isolated, no one nearby, just the intercom connection. The view was of the formation behind, of the sky they'd passed through. The tail gunner watched for fighters approaching from behind. The most common attack angle. 2 50 caliber guns, ready, waiting. The formation continued toward the target. The course was plotted to avoid known flak concentrations where possible. But certain areas were unavoidable. The approach to the target would take the formation over heavily defended territory, through flak fields, into range of fighters. The quiet of the current flight was temporary. Combat was coming. Everyone knew it. Everyone prepared for it. The peaceful cruise was borrowed time, an interlude before violence. The crew's experience at this point in the mission was sustained discomfort and vigilance. The cold was constant. The oxygen mask was claustrophobic, breathing through a regulator for hours. Every breath mechanical, controlled. The noise was overwhelming. 4 engines at cruise power. The roar never stopped, never decreased. Conversation was impossible without the intercom. Even with the intercom, communication required deliberate effort. Speaking clearly into the mask, listening carefully through the noise. The physical discomfort accumulated. The pilots sat in their seats. Backs began to ache. The bombardier and navigator in the cramped nose, legs uncomfortable, no room to stretch. The ball turret gunner in his fetal position, everything cramping, no relief possible. The waist gunners standing, legs tired, feet hurting, but sitting wasn't an option. Had to remain at stations, had to stay ready. The tail gunner sitting but unable to move, unable to shift position significantly. Just endurance, just accepting discomfort because there was no alternative. This was the reality of high-altitude bombing. Not just the combat, not just the enemy, but the environment, the sustained exposure to conditions that were hostile to human survival. The cold that never relented, the altitude that made every breath dependent on equipment, the discomfort that accumulated over hours, the noise that was physical assault. This was what the mission required, what flying in a B-17 meant. Hours of this before combat even began, hours more during and after. The endurance required was extraordinary, the tolerance for discomfort absolute, because the mission didn't stop for cold or fatigue or pain. The mission continued. The formation flew on, toward the target, toward the defenses, toward the violence that waited ahead. The bomber cruised toward the target at 25,000 feet. Each of the 10 crew members was at their station. Each had specific responsibilities, specific vulnerabilities. Understanding what each position entailed provides complete picture of life inside the B-17, of how 10 men functioned as a unit, of how survival depended on every member doing their job. The pilot sat in the left seat. He was aircraft commander, responsible for everything, for flying the bomber, for maintaining position in formation, for making decisions when things went wrong, when systems failed, when the aircraft was damaged, when crew members were injured or killed. The pilot's position had armor plating behind the seat, some protection from rear attacks, but the front and sides were vulnerable. Head-on fighter attacks targeted the cockpit, 20mm cannon fire. The armor helped sometimes. Often it didn't. The pilot flew with instruments in front of him, throttles at his right hand, control yoke in both hands, feet on rudder pedals, Flying formation at altitude for hours required constant small corrections, constant attention. Fatigue was inevitable but had to be managed. The pilot couldn't rest, couldn't stop flying. The aircraft required continuous control. The co-pilot sat in the right seat. He assisted with flying, monitored instruments while the pilot concentrated on formation keeping, called out readings, fuel state, engine temperature, problems developing. The co-pilot was backup. If the pilot was hit, wounded, killed, the co-pilot took over. Flew the aircraft, made the decisions. The co-pilot was also vulnerable to head-on attacks. Sat right next to the pilot. The same exposure, the same armor, the same risk. Both pilots were officers. Both were trained. Both capable of flying the bomber alone if necessary. The bombardier sat in the nose. Below and forward of the pilots. The nose was plexiglass, clear, excellent visibility, zero protection. The bombardier's position was perhaps the most vulnerable in the aircraft. Completely exposed to head-on attacks. To flak from in front, the plexiglass stopped wind, stopped cold to some degree, stopped nothing else. Bullets passed through, shrapnel passed through. The bombardier had the Norden bomb sight in front of him. Complex device, mechanical computer. During the bomb run, the bombardier controlled the aircraft. His adjustments fed through the autopilot. His responsibility was accuracy, putting bombs on target. That was the mission's entire purpose. Everything else existed to get the bombardier to the target, to give him the stable platform and time needed to aim. His work justified the mission, justified the risk, justified the casualties. The navigator sat behind the bombardier in the nose compartment, also surrounded by plexiglass, also completely exposed. The navigator's job was ensuring the formation reached the target, calculating position constantly, using maps, charts, instruments, dead reckoning, celestial navigation when possible, radio navigation when available. The navigator tracked wind drift, calculated course corrections, informed the pilot of heading changes needed, ensured the formation didn't get lost, didn't miss the target. The navigator also had a machine gun. Forward firing, could assist bombardier in defending against head-on attacks, but navigation was primary responsibility. The gun was secondary. The flight engineer sat behind the pilots, also served as top turret gunner. The engineer's position was above the bomb bay, between cockpit and radio room. The engineer had panels of instruments, engine gauges, fuel gauges, hydraulic pressure. The engineer monitored these constantly, watched for problems, managed fuel consumption, transferred fuel between tanks, made decisions about systems when damage occurred. The engineer operated the top turret, twin 50 caliber machine guns and a powered turret above the cockpit. The turret could rotate fully, could elevate and depress, provided defense against attacks from above and to the sides. The engineer was essential when things went wrong, when engines failed, when hydraulics were damaged, when electrical systems had problems. The engineer's expertise kept damaged aircraft flying, got them home when that seemed impossible. The radio operator sat aft of the bomb bay, more protected than the nose positions. Central in the aircraft, the radio operator maintained communications, monitored frequencies, passed information between pilot and command, between aircraft in the formation. The radio operator also manned a single 50 caliber machine gun, could fire through openings in the fuselage, provided some defense for the radio room area. The radio operator heard everything over the intercom. Every report from gunners, every call about fighters, every notification of crew members wounded, every system failure. The radio operator was information hub, knew the status of everything, witnessed the mission through sound when visual observation wasn't possible. The ball turret gunner occupied the most physically demanding position. The ball turret was a sphere hanging beneath the fuselage, approximately 4 feet in diameter, barely large enough for a man. The gunner entered from inside the aircraft after takeoff, squeezed through the opening, rotated into position, assumed a fetal position, knees pulled up, arms operating controls, head between knees. The position was impossible to maintain comfortably for more than minutes. The gunners maintained it for hours. The turret could rotate 360 degrees, could elevate and depress through wide arc. 2 50 caliber guns. The ball turret provided defense against attacks from below. From the 6 o'clock low position that was otherwise vulnerable. But the physical cost was severe. Everything cramped, no movement possible, no relief, no stretch. Just endurance, just maintaining position despite pain. Despite discomfort that became agony. The ball turret gunner also faced specific danger. If the aircraft's landing gear was damaged and couldn't extend, the ball turret couldn't be retracted. It would hit the runway on landing. The gunner would be crushed unless he could somehow exit the turret and re-enter the fuselage before landing, which was theoretically possible but difficult, under stress, with limited time. The ball turret gunners understood this risk. Flew, anyway. The waist gunners stood at open windows on either side of the rear fuselage. Each had a single 50 caliber machine gun on a flexible mount. The waist position was the worst for environmental exposure. The windows were open, had to be open for the guns to fire. The wind came through at aircraft speed, 200 miles per hour, at 60 below zero. The wind chill was beyond calculation, beyond anything measurable. The waist gunners wore all available protection, but the cold penetrated. They stood for the entire mission, 8 hours, 10 hours, standing in that wind, in that cold. Legs ached, feet hurt, but sitting wasn't option. Had to remain at guns, had to stay ready. The waist gunners worked close together, could see each other across the fuselage, but couldn't communicate over the noise without intercom. The empty shell casings from their guns collected on the floor, rolled underfoot, created hazard. The brass was slippery. The waist gunners had to be careful, had to watch footing while operating guns, while watching for fighters, while standing in wind that threatened to pull them off balance. The tail gunner sat at the rear of the aircraft, crawled back through the fuselage to reach the position, passed through the waist section, through a narrow opening into the tail. The position was cramped, small space. The gunner sat facing backward, looking at where the aircraft had been, at the formation behind, at empty sky. 2 50 caliber guns, the tail was the most common attack angle for German fighters. Attacking from behind, coming in fast, firing, then breaking away. The tail gunner was primary defense against these attacks. His position was critical, but it was isolated, lonely, no one else nearby, just the intercom connection, just the voice communication. The tail gunner sat in this isolation for hours, watching, waiting. The position was cold, not as bad as the waist guns. The tail section could be sealed somewhat, but still cold, still uncomfortable. The tail gunner couldn't leave, couldn't move forward, was committed to this position for the mission duration. 10 men, 10 positions, 10 specific roles, each necessary, each vulnerable, each contributing to the mission. The interdependence was absolute. The pilot couldn't fly formation without the engineer managing engines and fuel. The bombardier couldn't bomb without the navigator getting them to the target. The crew couldn't survive fighter attacks without the gunners protecting the aircraft. The bomber couldn't return if the engineer couldn't keep damaged systems functioning. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their job, doing it well, doing it despite fear, despite cold, despite exhaustion. Despite everything, the bonds between crew members formed in training intensified in combat. These 10 men trusted each other completely. Had to. There was no alternative. Your life was in their hands. Theirs was in yours. The trust couldn't be questioned, couldn't be partial. It was absolute, or the crew couldn't function, couldn't survive. Some crews developed close friendships, spent free time together, talked about families, about plans after the war. Other crews were more professional, did the job, flew the missions, but maintained distance emotionally. Both approaches worked. Both types of crews succeeded or failed based on competence and luck more than interpersonal relationships. But all crews, friendly or professional, had the same absolute dependence, the same trust, the same knowledge that survival required everyone. The diversity of backgrounds among crew members was significant. The pilot might be college-educated, officer training, middle-class background. The ball turret gunner might have 8th grade education, farm background. Enlisted. The navigator might be from New York City, the tail gunner from rural Montana. In civilian life, these men might never have met, might have had nothing in common. But in the bomber, background didn't matter. Education didn't matter. Only competence. Only doing the job. The aircraft and the mission created equality that civilian society didn't provide. The age was remarkably consistent. Early 20s predominantly, some 19, some 18 even, a few mid-20s. Rare to see anyone over 30 in a bomber crew. The physical demands favored youth. The training pipeline produced young men. The casualties meant replacement crews were constantly needed. The crew in any bomber was young, facing dangers that would challenge men twice their age, making decisions about life and death, about whether to continue with damaged aircraft, about whether crew members could be saved, about whether to bail out or try to make it home. Decisions that required judgment that typically comes with age and experience. But these young men made them, had to. There was no one else. The mission continued. The formation flew on, each crew member at their position, doing their job, watching their sector, maintaining their systems. The target was still ahead, still hours away, but the crew was ready, had been ready since takeoff. The vigilance sustained, the discomfort accepted, the fear managed, because this was what the mission required, what flying in a B-17 meant. 10 men in their positions, dependent on each other, flying into danger together, hoping to return together, knowing that some crews didn't, that the statistics were against them, but flying anyway. Because the mission required it, because the war required it, because they were the crew assigned to this aircraft, on this mission, today. The mission was now 3 hours old. The formation had crossed into German airspace, was approaching the area where enemy defenses would intensify, but before the combat came the endurance, the sustained exposure to an environment that was actively hostile to human life. Understanding this environment is essential to understanding what these crews experienced, what they endured, what flying at altitude in an unpressurized bomber meant. The cold at 25,000 feet was absolute. The outside air temperature was 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. To understand this temperature, consider that water freezes at 32 degrees. At 0 degrees, exposed skin freezes within minutes. At 20 below, exposed skin freezes in seconds. At 60 below, the temperature inside the B-17, exposed skin freezes nearly instantly. Touching metal with bare skin caused immediate frostbite. The flesh bonded to the metal, tearing away left skin behind. The crews learned quickly. Never touch metal with bare skin. Always gloves. Always protection. The aluminum fuselage conducted cold efficiently. The metal structure of the aircraft absorbed the outside temperature, radiated it into the interior. There was no insulation, no barrier. The structure itself was cold. Sitting against the fuselage wall meant cold penetrating through all layers of clothing. The crew avoided contact with structure when possible. But in the cramped positions, contact was often unavoidable. The cold pressed in from all sides. Unrelenting. Constant. The heated suits were the primary defense. The suits had wires woven throughout the fabric. The wires connected to the aircraft electrical system. Current ran through the wires, generated heat. The suits could maintain body temperature when functioning properly, could keep crew members warm enough to function, but the suits were not perfectly reliable. The wires were fragile. could break with repeated flexing, with wear. The connections could fail. The aircraft electrical system could be damaged by flak or fighters. When a heated suit failed, the crew member had perhaps 5 minutes before serious problems developed. Fingers became numb, toes lost sensation, core temperature began dropping. Recognition of the problem was essential, immediate troubleshooting necessary. Sometimes the problem could be fixed, a connection reseated, a broken wire bypassed. Sometimes it couldn't. Then the crew member endured, suffered through the cold, accepted frostbite, accepted injury, because leaving the position often wasn't possible. The mission continued. The position had to be manned. The waist gunners suffered most from cold. Their positions had open windows. The wind came through at 200 miles per hour. The wind chill combined 60 below temperature with 200 mile per hour wind. The effective temperature was beyond measurement, beyond human tolerance without protection. The waist gunners wore everything available, multiple layers. Heated suits, heavy gloves, face protection, goggles. But the wind found every gap, every opening, penetrated every layer eventually. Their hands suffered particularly. The gloves were heavy, insulated, heated, but operating the guns required dexterity, required feel. Sometimes the gloves had to come off, to clear a jam, to reload, to make adjustments. Bare hands exposed to 60 below wind for even seconds meant frostbite. The flesh froze, turned white, then gray. Later would turn black, would die, would be amputated. But in the moment, on the mission, the waist gunners did what was necessary. Removed gloves when required. Accepted the injury, accepted the cost, because the guns had to work, had to be ready. The alternative was worse. The oxygen system was the other critical life support. At 25,000 feet, the air pressure was 1/3 of sea level. The oxygen content was correspondingly low. The human body cannot extract enough oxygen from this thin air to maintain consciousness. Within 2 to 3 minutes, unconsciousness occurs. Within 10 to 15 minutes, death follows. Every crew member breathed through an oxygen mask for the entire mission above 10,000 feet. The masks covered nose and mouth. Straps held them tight against the face. A hose connected the mask to the oxygen system. The system supplied pure oxygen. A regulator adjusted flow based on altitude. At 25,000 feet, the flow was continuous. Every breath was pure oxygen through the regulator. Breathing through the mask for 8 hours was claustrophobic, uncomfortable. The mask was rubber, sealed against the face. Moisture from breath condensed inside, accumulated. The moisture froze at altitude temperature. Ice formed inside the mask, against the face. The ice was painful, interfered with breathing, had to be cleared periodically. The crew members would break the seal, remove the mask briefly, clear the ice, reseal, brief exposure to ambient air. The air was too thin. The crew member would feel lightheaded immediately. Vision would narrow, confusion would begin. The mask had to go back on quickly, within seconds. Longer exposure meant unconsciousness. The oxygen system was not perfectly reliable. Hoses could freeze. At 60 below, moisture in the hoses could freeze solid, block oxygen flow. The connections could fail. Seals could crack in the cold. The regulators could malfunction. When oxygen supply failed, the crew member had approximately 30 seconds of useful consciousness. 30 seconds to recognize the problem, to identify the cause, to fix it. If the problem was obvious, a disconnected hose, a visible break, it could be fixed. If the problem was less obvious, a frozen line, a failed regulator, fixing it was harder, sometimes impossible. The symptoms of oxygen deprivation were subtle initially. Euphoria sometimes, a sense of well-being. This was dangerous. The crew member might not recognize the problem, might not realize oxygen was failing. Confusion developed quickly. Vision narrowed to tunnel vision. Cognitive function decreased. The ability to problem solve degraded at the moment problem solving was most critical. If the crew member didn't fix the problem within 30 seconds, unconsciousness followed. Then death unless someone else noticed. Unless another crew member saw the unconscious man and provided emergency oxygen, shared their own supply or connected a backup system. Some crew members died from oxygen failure, quietly, without obvious distress, just lost consciousness, froze at their position, were discovered after landing, cold, dead. The cause wasn't always immediately apparent, just a man who didn't respond, who didn't move. The other crew members sometimes didn't notice during the mission. Everyone was isolated in their positions, focused on their own jobs. Only after landing, when everyone should disembark, would the missing response be noted, would the body be found. The noise level added to the environmental hostility. 4 Wright Cyclone engines at cruise power, each engine producing over 1,000 horsepower. The sound was continuous, overwhelming, physical. The crew felt it in their chests, in their bones. The frequency and volume were beyond anything experienced on the ground. Add to the engine noise the wind noise, the aerodynamic sounds of the aircraft moving through air at 280 miles per hour. The vibration of the structure, everything shaking slightly, constantly. The noise made conversation impossible without the intercom system. Even with the intercom, communication required effort, required speaking clearly, listening carefully. The crews developed economy of speech, brief reports, essential information only. The hearing damage was inevitable. The noise level exceeded safe exposure limits by enormous margins. The crew was exposed for 8 hours, 10 hours. Every mission, the damage accumulated. Tinnitus developed in everyone. The ringing in the ears that started during missions, that initially faded after landing, after a few hours, after a day. But as missions accumulated, the ringing persisted, became permanent. The hearing loss was measurable. High frequencies went first, then broader ranges. By the end of a tour, most crew members had significant permanent hearing loss. The damage was accepted, was considered inevitable, was part of the cost of flying. The physical discomfort from position was cumulative. The pilots sat in their seats. The seats were not comfortable, were functional. After an hour, backs began to ache. After 2 hours, the ache intensified. After 4 hours, pain was constant. After 8 hours, getting out of the seat was difficult. Muscles stiffened, backs spasmed, but the pilots couldn't leave the seats during flight, couldn't stand, couldn't stretch, had to remain in position, flying, maintaining formation, enduring. The ball turret gunner's position was worst for physical constraint. The fetal position, maintained for hours, knees pulled to chest, arms operating controls, head down, every muscle cramping, circulation restricted, legs going numb, back screaming, but no ability to stretch, no ability to move, just endurance, just accepting pain that intensified as hours passed. Some ball turret gunners described the relief of finally exiting the turret after landing as almost euphoric. The ability to straighten, to extend legs, to move, after hours of immobility. The waist gunners stood for the entire mission. 8 hours standing, feet hurt, legs ached, knees stressed. The floor was metal, cold, hard, no cushioning. The empty shell casings from their guns rolled underfoot, made footing uncertain. The waist gunners shifted weight, tried to ease the strain, but couldn't sit, couldn't rest, had to remain standing at the guns. Ready. The fatigue accumulated, made balance harder, made everything harder. The crew also dealt with basic biological needs. Urination during 8-hour missions was necessary. The aircraft had relief tubes, funnels connected to tubes that vented outside, but using them required removing multiple layers of clothing, required exposure to cold, required coordination difficult in bulky suits with heavy gloves. Some crew members avoided drinking before missions, tried to minimize need. Others accepted the difficulty, dealt with it when necessary. Defecation was generally avoided. The difficulty was too great. The crew would wait until landing, would endure the discomfort, would handle it afterward. The fatigue was both physical and mental. Physical fatigue from maintaining position, from operating in cold, from breathing through masks, from noise exposure. Mental fatigue from vigilance, from constant scanning, from monitoring systems, from watching for fighters, from maintaining concentration for hours. The fatigue accumulated through the mission, made everything harder, made mistakes more likely, but the crew couldn't rest, couldn't reduce alertness. The mission continued, the threats remained, the endurance was required. This was the environment inside a B-17 at altitude, before combat. Before flak and fighters, just the baseline conditions, the hostility of altitude and cold and noise and constraint, the sustained exposure that characterized every mission, the endurance required just to exist in this environment for hours. Understanding this provides context for everything else, for why the combat was so much worse, for why the casualties were so high, for why completing a tour was an achievement. The environment itself was enemy, was testing human limits, was demanding more than most humans were asked to endure. Yet the crews endured, mission after mission, day after day, for 25 missions, 30, 35. The endurance was extraordinary. The cost was high. The toll paid in hearing, in frostbite, in exhaustion, in wear on bodies and minds. But the missions continued. The bombers flew, the crews endured, because that was what was required. The formation was now 4 hours into the mission. The crew had been at altitude for over 3 hours. The endurance phase continued, but now the target approached. Germany's defenses were about to engage. The combat phase beginning, the danger escalating from environmental to active enemy action. The navigator called the course correction to the initial point. The IP, the beginning of the bomb run, the formation adjusted heading, tightened up, individual bombers closed the gaps, the combat box formation compressed, mutual defensive fire required proximity, required overlapping fields. The bombers flew closer together than comfortable, wingtip to wingtip distances measured in feet, vertical separation minimal. The formation was concentrated, prepared. The target was ahead. The first indication of defenses was flak, anti-aircraft artillery, German batteries positioned around all significant targets. The guns were radar-directed in many cases, could calculate altitude and speed, could predict where the bombers would be. The shells were fired with time fuses, set to explode at specific altitude. When the shell reached that altitude, it detonated, created a cloud of shrapnel. Steel fragments traveling at high velocity, expanding outward from the explosion, creating a sphere of deadly metal. The flak appeared as black puffs, sudden dark clouds against the sky. The explosions were visible from miles away. The formation flew toward them. Each puff was a shell detonating. Each represented dozens of shrapnel fragments. Each was potential death. The puffs multiplied. Dozens. Hundreds. The sky ahead filled with them. The formation had to fly through this. No evasion possible during the bomb run, just straight and level into the flak field. The sound of flak was distinctive. Muffled crumps when explosions were distant. Sharp cracks when close. The shrapnel hitting the aircraft made sounds. Pings on aluminum, thuds when fragments penetrated. The crew heard the impacts, felt them sometimes. Each impact was potential disaster. The shrapnel could hit anything, could damage engines, could penetrate fuel tanks, could sever control cables, could hit crew members. The flak field intensified as the formation approached the target. The German gunners concentrated fire. Multiple batteries firing, hundreds of shells in the air. The barrage was calculated. The Germans knew the bombers' altitude, knew their speed, knew the approach path because the IP was predictable. The bomb run had to approach from specific angles for the bombardier to see the target, to aim properly, The Germans knew these angles, positioned batteries accordingly, created concentrated fire along the expected path. The formation flew into this fire. The lead aircraft first, then the following aircraft, each bomber entering the flak field in sequence. The explosions were close now. The black puffs surrounded the formation. Fragments rattled against fuselages, punctured aluminum. The bombers shook from near misses. The crew felt the concussion, felt the aircraft buffeted by explosions. The violence was immediate, continuous. Some bombers were hit directly. The shell exploded inside or immediately adjacent to the aircraft. The results were catastrophic. The bomber would lurch, would fall out of formation, sometimes would explode entirely. A flash, debris, pieces falling, no survivors. The crew in adjacent aircraft watched, saw the hit, saw the bomber disappear, knew everyone aboard was dead, knew the same could happen to them, would happen if a shell detonated at the wrong place, at the wrong moment. The probability was random, was luck, was chance, nothing skill could prevent. Other hits were less catastrophic, but still severe. An engine hit, propeller stopped, fire sometimes. The bomber struggled to maintain altitude on 3 engines, fell behind the formation, isolated, vulnerable to fighters. Some made it home, some didn't. The crew watched these bombers fall behind, counted them, wondered if they'd make it, knew many wouldn't. The flak wounded and killed crew members. Shrapnel entered through fuselage, through plexiglass, hit men at their positions. The wounds were terrible. Jagged metal traveling at high velocity, penetrating flesh, bone, vital organs. Some wounds were immediately fatal. Head, chest. The crew member died instantly or within seconds. Other wounds were survivable but severe. Limbs, extremities. The bleeding was profuse. First aid was limited. Pressure on wounds, morphine for pain, bandages. The crew members tried to help, tried to stop bleeding, tried to stabilize, but resources were minimal. Medical expertise was limited. Sometimes help worked, sometimes it didn't. The bomb run lasted several minutes, typically 3 to 5 minutes. During this time, the bomber flew straight and level. No evasion, no maneuvering. The bombardier was on instruments, using the Norden bomb sight. The sight was connected to the autopilot. Small corrections were fed automatically. The bombardier adjusted for wind, for altitude, for speed. The calculations were complex. The sight helped, but precision required steady flight, required the bomber to maintain course despite the flak, despite everything. The crew knew this was the most dangerous phase. The predictable flight path, the inability to evade, the concentrated German fire. Every second felt extended, time distorted. 3 minutes seemed like 30. The crew maintained their positions, continued their jobs. The pilots held course, the engineer monitored engines. The gunners scanned for fighters, everyone doing their job despite the flak. Despite the fear, despite watching bombers around them being hit, being destroyed. The bombardier called out over the intercom. "Bomb bay doors open." The hydraulic motors whined. The doors beneath the fuselage opened, exposed the bombs. Rows of 500-pound or 1,000-pound bombs. The bombs were fused, armed. The additional drag from open doors was noticeable. The bomber slowed slightly. The pilot compensated with throttle. Maintained position. The formation continued. Straight, level, into the flak. Bombs away. The bombardier toggled the release. The bombs dropped, all at once. The bomber lurched upward, suddenly lighter by several tons. The relief was immediate, not from completion, but from the ability to maneuver. The instant the bombs released, the restriction ended. The pilot could evade, could turn, could descend. The formation began turning away from the target, away from the flak concentration, still taking fire, still in danger, but no longer constrained, no longer predictable targets. The bombs fell away, tumbled initially, then stabilized, fell toward the target below. The bombardiers in the formation aimed at the same point, at the aiming point designated in briefing. The lead bombardier's release triggered others. The formation dropped bombs in sequence, created a pattern on the ground. The bombs impacted. Explosions below. Smoke. Fire. The damage assessment was difficult from altitude. From distance. The bombs hit something. The crew couldn't know exactly what. That was for reconnaissance later. For damage assessment, photos. The crew's job was completed. Release bombs. Return home. But the return journey was hours away. The formation turned away from the target. Reformed. Counted aircraft. Some were missing. Some damaged. The gaps in the formation were visible. Were notable. The bombers that had been there were gone. Shot down. Crashed. The crews lost. The survivors continued. The mission was only half complete. The flight home remained. The dangers weren't over. German fighters would attack during the return. More flak would be encountered. Systems damaged during the bomb run might fail during the return flight. The endurance continued. But the bombs were gone. The mission's primary objective complete. Now just survival. Just getting home. The formation descended slightly. Altitude wasn't required anymore. Lower altitude meant slightly warmer, meant slightly higher air pressure, meant slightly easier breathing. Not much difference, but any improvement was welcome. The crew assessed damage, checked systems, reported status over intercom. The pilot and engineer evaluated, determined if the aircraft could make it home. Most could, some couldn't. The decisions were made. The course was set. The long flight back began. Hours yet ahead, hours of continued exposure, continued vigilance, continued danger. The bomb run was complete, but the mission was far from over. The German fighters appeared at high altitude. Small dots initially, distant, growing larger. The gunners called them out over the intercom. Fighters, 12 o'clock high, 9 o'clock level, 6 o'clock low. The positions announced. The crew tensed. The fighters meant immediate danger, meant violence that would arrive in seconds. The Luftwaffe used Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s primarily. Single-seat fighters, fast, maneuverable, armed with machine guns and 20mm cannons. The cannons were devastating against bombers, high explosive shells, designed to penetrate aircraft, to damage systems, to kill crews. The fighters had developed tactics specifically for attacking B-17 formations, had learned through experience what worked, what didn't. The tactics evolved, became more effective, more deadly. The head-on attack became preferred. Attacking from 12 o'clock, directly ahead. The fighters would position themselves ahead of the formation, several miles, at the same altitude or slightly higher. Then they would turn toward the bombers, would accelerate, would climb slightly, building speed, building energy. The attack run would begin from perhaps 2 miles away. The fighters coming head-on, fast. The closure rate was extraordinary. The bombers traveled at approximately 180 miles per hour. The fighters approached at over 300 miles per hour. Combined closure rate exceeded 500 miles per hour. The distance closed rapidly. 2 miles became 1 mile in seconds. 1 mile became half a mile. The fighters grew from dots to recognizable aircraft in moments. The bombers' forward-firing guns engaged. The bombardier and navigator in the nose fired. The engineer in the top turret swung guns forward. Fired. Tracer rounds streamed forward. The volume of fire from the formation was substantial. Dozens of guns firing. Thousands of rounds. But the targets were small, fast, moving at 500 miles per hour, relative. Most rounds missed. The fighters were hard to hit. The fighters opened fire. Machine guns, cannons. The muzzle flashes were visible. Bright, rapid. The rounds came in streams. Tracer rounds showed paths. The fire was concentrated, aimed. The German pilots were experienced, knew where to aim. Targeted the nose, the cockpit, the engines, the critical areas, the rounds impacted. Punched through aluminum, through plexiglass, through everything, the violence of the attack was total. The entire sequence from first firing to fighters passing through the formation lasted perhaps 10 seconds, maybe less. In those seconds, hundreds of rounds were fired by both sides. The sound inside the bomber was overwhelming. Guns firing, rounds impacting, the distinctive crack of 20mm cannons, the thuds of impacts, the chaos was complete. Then the fighters were past. Through the formation, gone. The attack over, the duration was brief. The effect was not. Bombers were hit, some severely, an engine on fire, a shattered nose, a wing damaged. Some bombers fell immediately, lost control, spiraled down. Others maintained formation but were wounded. Streaming fuel, missing chunks of structure, the damage visible to adjacent aircraft. Inside the bombers, the crew assessed, called out over intercom. Everyone report. The reports came in. Pilot okay, co-pilot okay, or pilot hit, co-pilot taking over, bombardier wounded, navigator dead. The casualty reports were immediate, direct. No time for emotion, just information, just status. The pilot needed to know who was functional, who wasn't, what systems were damaged, whether the aircraft could continue. The fighters circled, regrouped, would attack again. The defensive fire from the formation hadn't stopped them, hadn't shot many down, would rarely shoot down many. The fighters accepted losses as cost of attacking, but most survived each pass, would attack again. The bombers couldn't evade, couldn't outrun fighters, could only endure, could only rely on defensive fire, on formation integrity, on luck. The fighters attacked from different angles, head-on again, from below, from the sides, coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The German pilots communicated, coordinated. Multiple fighters attacking one bomber simultaneously, from different angles, dividing defensive fire, overwhelming the bomber's ability to respond to all threats. Some attacks were individual, a single fighter making a pass. Others were coordinated flights. 4 to 6 fighters attacking together. The coordinated attacks were most dangerous, most likely to destroy bombers. The bombers maintained formation. Isolation was death. A bomber that fell out of formation, that fell behind, that became separated, was easy target. Multiple fighters would swarm it, attack without interference from other bombers' defensive fire, would destroy it rapidly. The formation provided protection through overlapping fields of fire, through multiple gunners able to engage each fighter. The formation was survival. The pilots knew this, maintained position despite damage, despite wounded crew, despite everything. The gunners fired continuously during attacks, the ball turret tracking fighters from below. The waist gunners firing at fighters passing alongside or attacking from quarters. The tail gunner engaging fighters coming from behind. The sound was continuous. 50 caliber machine guns firing. The weapons cycled at approximately 800 rounds per minute. Multiple guns firing created wall of fire, wall of tracers. The tracers showed where fire was going, allowed adjustments, allowed coordination between gunners. The empty shell casings ejected into the aircraft interior, bounced off floors, off walls, rolled, accumulated. In the waist section, hundreds of casings collected, made footing treacherous. The brass was slippery. The waist gunners had to watch footing while fighting, while tracking fighters, while firing. The casings were hot. Touching, one with bare skin caused burns, but thick gloves made handling guns difficult, made clearing jams harder. The trade-offs were constant. Accept burns or accept reduced dexterity. The gun barrels heated. Sustained fire turned barrels cherry red. The heat was visible even in daylight. The barrels could fail if overheated, could warp, could explode. The gunners managed this, fired in bursts when possible, allowed cooling between bursts. But during intense attacks, sustained fire was necessary, was required. The risk of barrel failure was accepted, was less than the risk of not firing, not suppressing the attack. Some fighters were hit, damaged, smoking. Occasionally one was destroyed, exploded, spiraled down. The bomber crews watched, counted. Small victories, small successes, but the fighters kept coming. More fighters. The Luftwaffe had reserves, had many more fighters than the formation could shoot down. The attrition favored the defenders if the battle was of short duration, favored the attackers if prolonged. The formation's goal was to get through, to survive, not to destroy all attackers, just to make attacking costly enough that fighters would break off, would seek easier targets. The attacks continued for perhaps 30 minutes, varied by location, by fighter availability, by German tactical decisions. 30 minutes of repeated attacks, of fighters coming from multiple directions, of continuous defensive fire, of bombers being hit, falling, exploding. The intensity was sustained, the violence continuous. The crew had no breaks, no rest, just fighting, just surviving. When the fighters finally broke off, the relief was immediate but incomplete. The immediate threat was gone, but the formation was damaged. Bombers were missing, crew members were wounded or dead, aircraft systems were damaged, the engines were stressed, fuel was leaking. The formation had to continue, had to fly on, had to get home despite damage, despite casualties, despite everything. The fighter attacks were over for now, but the mission continued. The long flight home remained, hours yet to endure. The formation was smaller now. Gaps existed where bombers had been. The crews in surviving aircraft looked at those gaps, understood what they meant. Each empty position was a bomber lost. Each bomber was 10 men. The mathematics was simple, visible. The losses were not abstract, were not distant, were right there, in the formation, where bombers should be, but weren't. A bomber to the left took a direct flak hit during the bomb run. The shell detonated inside the fuselage. The explosion was bright, a flash. Then the bomber came apart, wings separated, fuselage broke, pieces tumbled, fell. There was no time for the crew to react, no time to bail out. The bomber went from flying to debris in seconds. 10 men died instantly. No survivors, no parachutes. The crews in adjacent aircraft saw it, watched the flash, watched the pieces fall, knew everyone was dead, processed it immediately, filed it away, continued flying, continued their mission, because that was what was required. Another bomber lost an engine to fighter attack. The engine was hit by 20mm cannon. Exploded, caught fire. The fire spread along the wing. The pilot feathered the propeller on the damaged engine, shut down fuel flow, activated fire suppression. The fire continued, grew. The wing was burning. Fuel tanks were in the wing. If the fire reached the tanks, the bomber would explode. The pilot ordered bailout. The crew began jumping, opening the bomb bay, going out through the rear door, through the nose hatch, one by one. The parachutes opened, white canopies. The crew and other bombers counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all 10. The entire crew escaped. The bomber continued flying for a moment. Then the wing failed, folded up. The bomber spiraled down, crashed, but the crew survived, would be captured, would spend the rest of the war as prisoners. But they were alive. Not all bailouts were complete. A bomber hit by multiple fighters, damaged severely, losing altitude, couldn't maintain formation, falling behind. The pilot ordered bailout. Some crew members jumped. Parachutes opened, 2, 3, 4. Then nothing. The bomber continued down. The remaining crew either couldn't reach exits, couldn't jump, or chose to stay with the aircraft, tried to crash land. The bomber disappeared below, into clouds. The crew watching counted parachutes, knew 6 or 7 men didn't make it, wondered why, wondered what happened inside that bomber, wondered if they suffered. The parachute count became automatic. Every bomber hit, every bomber going down. The crews watched, counted parachutes. Each parachute was a survivor, was someone who would be captured but would live. Empty parachutes meant death, meant crew members who didn't escape, who died in the bomber, who died in the crash. The count was grim necessity, was acknowledgement, was witness. Sometimes the parachute count was confusion, multiple bombers going down simultaneously. Parachutes from different aircraft mixing, unable to determine which chutes came from which bomber. The count became estimate, became uncertain, but the attempt was still made. Still important, the need to know, to document, to witness who survived and who didn't. The bombers that fell were recognized, were known. The formation was tight, the aircraft close. You knew which bombers were in which positions, knew the nose art, knew the names, sometimes knew the crews, had talked to them at briefings, had shared meals, had flown previous missions together. Watching their bomber fall was personal, was loss of acquaintances, sometimes friends. The emotional impact was immediate, was sharp, but had to be controlled, had to be filed away. The mission continued. Your bomber was still flying. Your crew was still alive. Had to focus on that, on surviving, on getting home. The fear this created was rational, was based on direct observation. You watched bombers hit, watched them explode or fall or burn, watched crews die or bail out. The danger wasn't theoretical, wasn't abstract, was visible, observable, happening right in front of you. The recognition that your bomber could be next was inescapable. The flak was still there. The fighters were still attacking. The probability said that eventually, statistically, you would be hit. Would be the bomber falling. Would be the crew bailing out or dying. The fear based on observation, based on mathematics, based on seeing exactly what could happen because it was happening to others. Some crews developed fatalism, accepted that death was likely, that the odds were against completing tours, focused on the mission, on doing the job, on controlling what could be controlled. The fatalism wasn't defeat, was acceptance, was pragmatism, allowed functioning despite fear, allowed continuing despite knowing the risks. Other crews struggled more. The fear was harder to manage. The observation of losses made anxiety worse, made each mission harder, made sleep harder, made everything harder. But they continued, flew the missions, did their jobs, because there was no alternative, because orders were orders, because the crew depended on them, because not flying wasn't option. The formation continued despite losses. The combat box reformed, closed gaps where possible, adjusted positions, maintained defensive integrity. The bombers that remained flew on. The crew inside those bombers processed what they'd seen, what they'd witnessed, the bombers falling, the parachutes or lack of them, the deaths, the losses, processed it while continuing their own mission, while flying their own bomber, while scanning for more fighters, while monitoring systems, while doing all the tasks their positions required. The losses accumulated across the mission, across the tour. A crew flying their 10th mission had seen multiple bombers fall on previous missions, had watched dozens of parachutes, had counted them, had wondered about the ones that didn't appear. By the 15th mission, the observations numbered in dozens. By the 20th, in hundreds perhaps. The accumulation created weight, created understanding, created absolute clarity about the risks, about the probability, about what completion of a tour required. Required not just skill, not just courage, but luck, random chance, being in the right place, not being in the wrong place, surviving when others didn't through factors beyond control. The crews who survived missions where many bombers fell experienced survivor's guilt sometimes, wondering why their bomber wasn't hit, why they survived when others didn't. The guilt was irrational but real, the feeling that survival was undeserved, that others were just as skilled, just as careful, just as deserving, but died while you lived. The processing of this took time, took support, took talking with other crew members who felt the same, or didn't talk about it, kept it internal, carried it silently. The watching of bombers fall was part of every mission where combat occurred, part of every bomber crew's experience. The visual confirmation of danger, the observation of statistics made real, the counting of parachutes that marked difference between life and death, the recognition that the bomber falling could be yours, that the parachutes could be your crew, that the flash of explosion could be your end. The fear was rational, was based on evidence, was confirmed by observation, mission after mission. The bombers fell. The crews watched, counted, remembered, and flew on, because the mission required it, because the war required it, because they were bomber crews, and flying was what they did. Despite the losses, despite the fear, despite knowing that watching bombers fall meant someday, possibly, others would watch yours. The bomber had been hit. The crew knew it immediately. The sound of impact, the shudder of the aircraft, the change in engine note. Something was wrong. The pilot called for status reports. Each crew member responded, or didn't. The silence when someone didn't respond was louder than any words. The right outboard engine was damaged. Fighter attack. 20mm cannon rounds. One had hit the engine directly. The engine was running rough. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. The flight engineer watched the gauges, called out readings. The pilot made the decision. Shut it down. Feather the propeller. 3 engines now. The bomber could fly on 3. But altitude would be difficult to maintain. Speed would decrease. The formation would pull ahead. The bomber would be alone. The pilot worked to maintain altitude. Advanced throttles on the remaining 3 engines. Maximum power. The engines strained. Temperature climbed, but altitude held, for now. The question was whether it would hold for the hours ahead. Whether fuel consumption at maximum power would exhaust tanks before reaching England. Whether the remaining engines would overheat, would fail. The calculations were complex. The engineer worked through them. Estimated fuel, estimated distance. The numbers were close. Possible but not certain. The bombardier was wounded. Fighter attack. The head-on pass. Rounds had come through the plexiglass nose. One struck the bombardier. Left shoulder. Upper chest. The wound was bleeding, profusely. The navigator applied first aid, pressure on the wound, bandages. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. The bombardier was conscious, in pain. The navigator administered morphine from the first aid kit, a syringe. Squeezed the morphine into the bombardier's leg. The pain decreased. The bombardier's awareness faded slightly. He was stable for now, but needed medical attention, real medical attention, hospital, surgery, not just first aid in a bomber at altitude. The waist gunner was dead. Flak. A shell had detonated close to the aircraft. Shrapnel had penetrated the fuselage, had hit the waist gunner. Multiple fragments, chest, abdomen, head. The wounds were catastrophic. He had died within seconds. The other waist gunner had applied pressure, had tried to stop bleeding, but the wounds were too severe, too many. The man was dead. The body remained at the position, strapped in. The other waist gunner continued his job, continued scanning for fighters, continued manning his gun. The body was there, was impossible to ignore, but the mission continued, the job continued. The living continued fighting. The hydraulic system was damaged, flak or fighters. Something had severed a line. The fluid was leaking, spraying into the bomb bay. The hydraulic pressure was dropping. The system controlled landing gear, flaps, brakes. Without hydraulics, landing would be difficult, dangerous. The engineer assessed, calculated, the fluid remaining, the leak rate. Whether enough would remain for landing. The answer was uncertain. Would depend on how quickly they reached base, on whether the leak worsened, on luck. The intercom was partially damaged. Some stations weren't receiving. weren't transmitting. Communication was fragmented. The pilot could reach some crew members. Others were isolated. The navigator in the nose couldn't hear the pilot. Had to rely on hand signals from the bombardier, on visual cues. The coordination was harder, less certain, but not impossible. The crew adapted, used backup methods, continued functioning despite the communication difficulty. The formation was ahead now. The damaged bomber couldn't keep up. Even with 3 engines at maximum power, the speed was less than formation crews. The gap widened. Slowly but steadily, the other bombers pulled away. Within 30 minutes, the formation was out of sight. The bomber was alone, isolated, vulnerable. Alone meant different threat calculation. No mutual defensive fire. No other bombers to share fire with. If fighters found the damaged bomber, the defense was limited. Just the bomber's own guns. Against multiple fighters, the odds were poor. The crew knew this, scanned constantly, watched for fighters, hoped the Luftwaffe was occupied elsewhere, hoped to slip through unnoticed. The pilot descended gradually. Altitude cost fuel at maximum power. Lower altitude meant less power required, meant fuel conservation. But lower altitude meant more exposure to flak if crossing defended areas. The pilot chose a course to avoid known flak concentrations, routed around them even if it meant extra distance. The trade-off was worthwhile. Flak was certainty of fire. Empty sky was possibility of fighters. The possibility was preferred. The flight continued. Hours remained. The coastline was distant. The distance seemed infinite. The navigator calculated constantly. Position, course, time to coast, everything uncertain. Dead reckoning with limited references. But the heading was generally correct. Toward England, toward home. The fuel gauges showed steady decrease. The engineer monitored, recalculated range. The numbers were still possible, still hopeful, but the margin was small. The wounded bombardier's condition was stable. The morphine helped with pain. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but he needed real medical care soon. The navigator kept checking on him, made sure he was conscious, alert enough. The bombardier responded, weak but present. The flight to base was medical race now. Get there before the wound worsened, before complications developed, before the morphine wore off and pain returned. The dead waist gunner remained at his position. The other waist gunner had covered the body with a blanket, had tried to provide some dignity, some respect, but the body was still there, still visible. A constant reminder, a constant weight. The crew processed this differently. Some tried not to look, focused on their jobs. Others acknowledged it, accepted it, knew that combat meant death sometimes. That this was the reality they'd signed up for, that it could have been them, that next mission it might be. The English Channel appeared finally, the coastline, the water grey and cold, but welcome. The relief was immediate. Over friendly territory now, still had to reach base, still had to land, but the immediate threat of being shot down over enemy territory was past. If the bomber crashed now, it would crash in England. The crew would likely survive, would receive help. The psychological difference was significant. The tension decreased slightly. The pilot called ahead, radioed the tower, emergency landing, wounded aboard, dead aboard, damaged aircraft. The response was immediate, cleared for straight-in approach. Ambulance standing by, fire equipment ready, the base prepared for their arrival, for the emergency, for the wounded, for the dead. The approach began. The hydraulics were nearly depleted. Landing gear extension was uncertain. The engineer worked the manual backup system, cranking by hand. Slowly the gear descended, locked, partially. One main gear fully down, one partially, nose gear down. Not ideal, but might work. The pilot would have to land carefully. Keep weight off the partial gear as long as possible. The landing would be difficult. Flaps wouldn't extend, no hydraulic pressure. The approach speed would be higher, the landing distance longer. The pilot adjusted, approached faster, aimed to touch down early on the runway, to maximize distance available. The crew braced, prepared for rough landing, for the possibility of crash, but also for the possibility of success, of survival. The touchdown was hard. The main gear hit first. The partial gear held, barely. The pilot maintained control, held the nose up as long as possible. Then the nose gear came down. Contacted runway. The bomber rolled, slowed, brakes barely functional without hydraulics. But the runway was long. The aircraft slowed, gradually, finally stopped, still intact, still upright. The mission was over, the landing complete. The crew had survived. The engines shut down. The sudden silence was jarring after hours of noise. The crew sat for a moment, processing, then action. The navigator helped the wounded bombardier toward the hatch. The ambulance arrived. Medics entered, took over, placed the bombardier on a stretcher, carried him out, to the ambulance, to the hospital, to surgery. The dead waist gunner was removed, carefully, respectfully, placed on another stretcher, covered, taken away. The process was practiced, efficient, somber. The crew watched, said nothing. There was nothing to say. The death was real, was final, was the cost of the mission. The crew exited the aircraft, stood on the tarmac, looked at the bomber. The damage was visible. Holes in the fuselage, the feathered propeller on the dead engine. Hydraulic fluid staining the bomb bay. The aircraft was battered, wounded, but had brought them home, had done its job. The crew felt attachment, gratitude. The bomber had saved them, had kept flying despite damage, had gotten them back. The debriefing followed. Intelligence officers asking questions. What happened? Where? When? The crew answered, described the mission, the flak, the fighters, the damage, the casualties. The information was recorded, documented, added to the growing database of missions flown, of losses taken, of targets bombed. The crew's experience became data points, became statistics. The process was necessary, was impersonal, was how the military understood the campaign, understood what was working, what wasn't. The personal processing would come later, in the barracks, at night, in the silence. The crew would think about the mission, about the bombardier's wound, about the dead waist gunner, about the bombers they'd watched fall, about how close they came to not making it. The processing took time, took talking with crew members, or didn't take talking, took silence, took private reflection, took whatever each man needed to file it away, to prepare for the next mission, because there would be a next mission, tomorrow, perhaps. The day after, certainly. The tour wasn't complete. More missions remained, more exposure, more risk. The statistics continued accumulating, the probability continued compounding, but they had survived today. That was something, that was everything, for now. The damaged bomber continued alone toward England. The formation was gone. Long ahead, out of sight. The isolation was complete. The crew was alone with their wounded aircraft, with their casualties, with the uncertain probability of reaching home. The 3 remaining engines ran steadily. The pilot had reduced power slightly after descending. The lower altitude required less power for flight. The fuel consumption decreased. The calculations improved, but the margins remained tight. The engineer continued monitoring, watched fuel gauges, calculated consumption, estimated time to coast, to base. The numbers fluctuated as conditions changed, as wind shifted, as power adjustments were made. But the trend was positive, possible. The fuel would last if nothing else went wrong. The wounded bombardier remained conscious. The morphine had dulled the pain. The bleeding had stopped mostly, but he was weak, pale. The navigator stayed with him, monitored his condition, talked to him, kept him alert, kept him focused. The flight to base was long. Hours still. had to keep the bombardier stable, had to prevent shock, had to ensure he remained conscious and responsive. The rest of the crew maintained vigilance. The gunners scanned constantly for fighters. The ball turret rotated. The waist gunner watched his sector. The tail gunner faced backward, watched behind, all alert, all ready. The bomber was vulnerable, alone, an easy target if discovered. The Luftwaffe sometimes patrolled return routes, sought damaged bombers, stragglers, isolated aircraft. The crew knew this, remained ready, hoped to avoid contact, hoped the fighters were elsewhere. The landscape below was occupied Europe, enemy territory. The bomber flew over it at reduced altitude, perhaps 15,000 feet now, lower than operational altitude, but still high enough to be relatively safe from light flak. The crew could see the ground more clearly at this altitude. Roads, villages, rivers. The detail was greater, the connection to the ground more immediate. This was enemy ground. If the bomber crashed here, if the crew bailed out here, capture was certain. Prison camps awaited. The crew wanted to avoid this, wanted to reach England, wanted to reach base. The minutes accumulated slowly, became tens of minutes, became an hour. The fuel decreased steadily. The gauges showed the drop. The engineer recalculated constantly. The numbers remained possible, remained hopeful, but nothing was certain. The fuel system was old. The gauges were mechanical. The readings were approximate. The actual fuel might be more or less than indicated. The uncertainty was uncomfortable, but nothing could be done except continue. Hope the readings were accurate. Hope the calculations were correct. The crew's fatigue was significant. The mission had been 6 hours now. 7 hours. The combination of physical discomfort, mental stress, and combat had exhausted everyone. The adrenaline that sustained during combat was fading. The crash was arriving. Energy depleted, awareness decreased. Mistakes became more likely, but the crew had to maintain function, had to stay alert. The mission wasn't over. The dangers remained. Rest would come after landing, not before. The formation of returning bombers appeared ahead. Different formation, different group, heading home as well. The pilot considered joining them, the safety of formation, the mutual defense. But the damaged bomber was slower, would struggle to maintain position, would slow the formation. The decision was to continue alone, maintain best speed, accept the isolation. The formation passed, pulled ahead. The damaged bomber continued, alone again. The coastline of occupied France appeared finally, the boundary between land and channel. The crossing point. The bomber would cross here, over water, then to England. The sight was encouraging. Progress, distance covered, less distance remaining, but the channel was dangerous too. The water was cold. Survival time measured in minutes if the bomber ditched. The crew checked their May West life vests, ensured they were secure, ensured they knew where the life rafts were. The preparation was automatic, routine, but important. The water appeared below, gray, choppy, cold. The bomber flew over it. The engines continued running, steady, reliable. The crew watched the engines, watched the coastline ahead. England was visible, distant but present. The sight brought relief, brought hope. Almost home, almost safe. The fuel would last, the engines would continue. The bomber would make it. The English coast approached, passed beneath. Land again. Friendly land. The relief was physical, palpable. The crew relaxed slightly. Not much, not completely. Still had to reach base, still had to land, but over friendly territory now. The immediate threat was past. The survival probability had increased significantly. The navigator provided heading to base. The pilot adjusted course, the direct route. No need to avoid anything now, just straight to base. Fastest route. Save fuel, save time. Get the wounded to medical care. Get everyone on the ground. End the mission. The base appeared ahead. The familiar layout, the runways, the buildings, the other aircraft. Some already landed. The formation that left hours earlier. The damaged bomber was late. Was last, but was arriving. The pilot called the tower, declared emergency. The response was immediate. Clearance for landing, priority. Ambulance and fire equipment standing by. The approach was difficult. The hydraulics were gone. Landing gear was extended manually, partially. One main gear fully locked, one uncertain. Nose gear down. The flaps wouldn't extend. The approach speed would be high. The landing distance long. The pilot briefed the crew. Prepared them, braced for impact. The landing would be rough, might be crash. Prepare accordingly. The crew strapped in. Secured everything, prepared for rough landing. The ball turret gunner exited the turret. Came into the fuselage. Took a position where he could brace. The waist gunner sat. Secured himself. Everyone ready, everyone braced. The pilot flew the approach. High speed, steep. Aimed for early touchdown. Maximum runway available. The runway threshold passed. The bomber descended. The main gear contacted. Hard. The partial gear held, momentarily, then gave way. The bomber dropped. The right wing struck the runway. The propeller hit. Sparks. The bomber slewed right. The pilot fought for control, applied left rudder, used remaining brake. The bomber slowed, skidded, finally stopped, off the runway, in the grass, but stopped, upright. The engines shut down. Silence. The crew sat for a moment, processing, alive, on the ground, safe. Then action. Exit the aircraft. The navigator helped the bombardier. The ambulance approached. Medics took over. The bombardier was evacuated. To hospital. The dead waist gunner was removed, respectfully, carefully, the process efficient but somber. The crew stood on the ground, looked at the bomber. The damage was extensive. The wing was damaged from the runway strike. The landing gear had collapsed. The engine was dead. The fuselage was punctured by flak and bullets. The aircraft was battered, wounded, might be repairable, might not. That was for maintenance to determine. For now, it had done its job, had brought the crew home. Most of them. One was dead. One was wounded. But 8 had survived, had made it back. The bomber had saved them. The debriefing followed. Questions, answers, documentation. The mission was recorded. Another sortie, another target, another set of losses, another set of survivors. The crew answered mechanically, exhausted, wanting only sleep, wanting only rest. But the debriefing was necessary, was required. The information was needed. So they answered, described, reported. Finally, they were dismissed, could go to barracks, could rest. The walk to barracks was quiet. The crew didn't talk, just walked, processing internally, thinking about the mission, about the bombardier's wound, about the dead waist gunner, about the bombers they'd watched fall, about how close they came, about the next mission, about how many more missions remained, about whether they'd survive them. The thoughts were heavy, but private. Each man carried them alone. Sleep came with difficulty. The body was exhausted. The mind was active. Replaying the mission, processing. Eventually sleep arrived. Brief, interrupted. But rest. Some rest. Tomorrow would bring another day, possibly another mission. The tour continued. The accumulation continued. One mission closer to completion, but many more remaining. The long road to 25, to 30, to 35. Each mission was exposure, was risk, was probability accumulating, but today they had survived. That was something. That was everything, for now. The mission just described was one mission, one sortie among thousands, one bomber among hundreds, one crew among many. But this pattern repeated, day after day. week after week, month after month, through 1942, 43, 44, 45. The campaign continued, the missions accumulated, the casualties mounted, the tour length defined the goal. Initially, 25 missions. Complete 25 missions and you went home. Rotated back to the United States, to training duties, to anything other than combat. 25 missions was the number everyone counted toward. Marked off, celebrated quietly, dreaded reaching and dreaded not reaching simultaneously. The paradox of the tour was that each mission completed brought you closer to going home, but also brought you closer to the statistical probability of being hit, being killed. The Schweinfurt raids in August and October of 1943 exemplified the cost. The target was ball-bearing factories, critical to German war production, heavily defended, deep in Germany, before long-range fighter escorts were available. The bombers went in alone. The August raid lost 36 bombers. The October raid lost 77. Each bomber held 10 men. The casualties from just 2 missions numbered in the hundreds, dead or captured or missing. The loss rate was unsustainable, but the missions continued anyway because the targets mattered, because the war demanded it. During 1943, before the P-51 Mustang escorts arrived in significant numbers, the loss rates on some missions exceeded 20%. 20%. 1 in 5 aircraft didn't return. The mathematical reality was stark. If loss rates remained at 20%, a crew couldn't complete 25 missions. The probability was effectively zero. Some crews did complete tours during this period. The statistical outliers, the extraordinarily lucky or skilled or both. But most didn't. Most were killed or captured or wounded before completing 25 missions. The calculation crews performed was simple. If each mission has 20% loss rate, what is probability of surviving 25 missions? The answer is less than 1%, less than 1 in 100. The crews understood this, did the math, knew the odds, flew anyway, because orders were orders, because the war demanded it, because they were crew members, because not flying wasn't option. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts changed the calculus. The P-51 Mustang could accompany bombers to targets deep in Germany, could protect the formations, could engage German fighters before they reached the bombers. The loss rates decreased significantly, from 20% to 10% to 5%. Still high, still dangerous, but survivable. The probability of completing a tour improved. More crews made it. More men went home after 25 missions. The escorts made the difference between probable death and possible survival. But even with escorts, the missions remained deadly. Flak continued. Fighter attacks still occurred. Systems still failed. Weather still killed. Operational accidents still happened. The risk decreased, but never disappeared. Every mission was exposure. Every mission was probability. Every mission was chance. The accumulated risk over 25 missions was substantial even with improved survival rates. The tour length was increased, from 25 to 30 missions, then to 35. The increase reflected the improved survival rates, reflected the military's need for experienced crews to continue flying. But for the crews, the increase was bitter, meant more exposure, more risk, more missions before going home. The men who had been counting down to 25 suddenly faced 30, then 35. The psychological impact was significant. The goal receded, the finish line moved, the endurance required increased, the ways men died were varied. Flak was common. Direct hits destroyed bombers instantly. Near misses damaged aircraft and killed crew members with shrapnel. Fighters killed with cannon fire and machine guns. Oxygen failure killed silently. Men lost consciousness, froze at their positions, were found dead after landing. Mechanical failure killed. Engines quit. Controls failed. Bombers crashed. Cold killed. Frostbite led to gangrene, to amputation, sometimes to death from infection. Some deaths were quick, instant, no suffering, direct hits, explosions, gone in a flash. Other deaths were slow. Wounded men bleeding out over hours, unable to receive adequate care, dying on the flight home, in the bomber, with crew members trying to help but unable to do enough. The slow deaths were harder, for the dying, for the witnesses, for everyone. Some men were captured, bailed out over enemy territory, landed in occupied Europe, were picked up by German forces, spent the rest of the war in prisoner camps. The conditions varied. Some camps were tolerable. Some were terrible. Men died in captivity, from mistreatment, from disease, from starvation. Survival as prisoner wasn't guaranteed, but was better than death in combat. Most men preferred capture to dying. The logic was simple. Captured meant alive, meant possibility of going home after war ended. Death was final. The casualty statistics for B-17 crews are documented. Approximately 47,000 men served as B-17 crew members in the European theater. Over 4,000 B-17s were lost to enemy action. Each loss was 10 crew members killed, captured, or wounded. The total casualties numbered in tens of thousands. The exact figures vary by source, by how casualties are counted, but all sources agree the losses were enormous. The casualty rate was among the highest in the American military during World War II. The comparison to ground infantry is stark. Infantry casualty rates were high, terrible. But bomber crew casualty rates during peak periods exceeded infantry rates. The difference was the concentration. Infantry operated continuously. The exposure was spread over time. Bomber crews had intense exposure during missions. Then, relative safety at base between missions. The concentrated nature of the risk made it psychologically different, made each mission a discrete event with high probability of death. The physical toll on survivors was significant. Hearing loss was universal. Tinnitus affected everyone. The constant ringing never stopped. Deafness was common. Requiring hearing aids, struggling with conversation, the damage was permanent, irreversible. Frostbite caused long-term problems, reduced circulation, sensitivity to cold, pain in damaged extremities. Some amputations were required. Fingers, toes, ears. The cold injury had lasting consequences. The psychological toll was perhaps greater. What would later be called PTSD was common. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance, the anxiety, the inability to adjust to civilian life. Many survivors struggled for years, for decades. The war had changed them, the experience had marked them, the memories didn't fade, the fear didn't disappear. The processing took time, took help, took understanding that wasn't always available. Some men found community with other veterans, connected with crew members, maintained bonds formed in combat, found others who understood, who had been there, who knew without explanation. These connections helped, provided support, provided validation. The shared experience created understanding that civilians couldn't provide. Other men isolated, didn't talk about the war, tried to move on, tried to forget. The strategy worked for some. The memories stayed buried. Life continued. Others found that isolation made things worse, that the unexpressed trauma festered, that talking would have helped. But the cultural expectation was silence, was moving on, was not dwelling on the past. So many suffered alone. The recognition of their service came slowly. Initially, there was celebration of victory, then desire to forget the war, to move on. The veterans were expected to return to civilian life, to reintegrate, to be normal. The expectation was unrealistic, but it was the expectation nonetheless. Later, as understanding of combat trauma improved, the recognition came. The acknowledgement that what these men experienced was extraordinary, was traumatic, was deserving of support and treatment. The missions continued until May 1945, until Germany surrendered, until the war in Europe ended. The crews flew until the end. The casualties continued until the end. Men died in late April, early May, days before the war ended. The tragedy of dying so close to peace was profound. But war doesn't pause for approaching peace, doesn't stop for the calendar. The missions flew until they didn't need to anymore, until victory was achieved, until Germany was defeated. The bomber crews of World War II accomplished their mission. The strategic bombing campaign damaged German war production, disrupted transportation, destroyed oil refineries. The debate about effectiveness continues, about whether the cost was justified by results. But the crews did what was asked, flew the missions, bombed the targets, paid the price. The cost was high. The casualties were terrible. But the mission was accomplished. Germany was defeated. The war was won. And the men who flew in the B-17s, those who survived and those who didn't, were part of that victory, paid for that victory, earned that victory through service and sacrifice and endurance beyond what most humans are asked to give. The war ended. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The crews who survived their tours returned home. The transition from combat to peace was jarring. Immediate. One day flying missions. Next day the war was over. The missions stopped. The aircraft were grounded. The crews went home. But the experience didn't stay behind. Couldn't be left in England. Couldn't be left at altitude. Came with them. Part of them now. Permanent. The physical injuries were visible. Obvious. Hearing loss affected nearly everyone who flew. The constant exposure to engine noise, to gunfire, to wind, the damage was cumulative. Permanent. Most crew members couldn't hear well after the war, required hearing aids, struggled with conversation, had to ask people to repeat themselves, to speak louder. The social difficulty this created was significant. Conversation was labor, was exhausting. Some veterans withdrew. Avoided situations where hearing difficulty would be obvious. The isolation this created was self-reinforcing. The tinnitus was perhaps worse. The constant ringing, high-pitched tone, present always, never stopping. Some veterans described it as maddening, as torture. Prevented silence, prevented rest, made sleep difficult, made concentration hard. There was no treatment, no cure, just endurance, just living with sound that never stopped, that was with you every moment, every day, for the rest of your life. Frostbite injuries created chronic problems. The damaged tissue never fully recovered, remained sensitive to cold, would hurt in winter, would ache in cold weather. Some veterans moved to warm climates to avoid triggering the pain. Others endured, wore extra layers, avoided cold exposure when possible. The injuries sustained at altitude had consequences that lasted decades. The psychological injuries were less visible, less understood. PTSD wasn't recognized as formal diagnosis until 1980, decades after the war. But the symptoms existed regardless of diagnosis. The nightmares were common. Dreams of missions, of flak, of fighters, of bombers falling, of crew members dying. The dreams were vivid, realistic. Waking from them was disorienting. Sometimes the veteran didn't know immediately where he was, when he was. Thought he was still in the bomber, still on the mission. The confusion was brief but disturbing. Flashbacks occurred for some, triggered by sounds, by sights, by smells, the sound of aircraft engines, the sight of bombers in museums or air shows, the smell of engine exhaust. These stimuli could trigger immediate response. The veteran would be back at altitude, back in combat. The present would disappear, replaced by memory so vivid it felt real. The flashbacks lasted seconds usually, sometimes minutes. Then awareness would return. The veteran would recognize where he actually was, would understand it was memory, not reality, but the experience was frightening, was disorienting, was beyond conscious control. Hypervigilance persisted in many veterans, the constant alertness, the scanning for threats, useful in combat, problematic in civilian life. Veterans found themselves constantly checking surroundings, watching doors, watching windows, assessing people, looking for danger that wasn't there. The behavior was automatic, exhausting, created anxiety, made relaxation impossible, made peace elusive. Sleep disturbances were nearly universal. Difficulty falling asleep, waking frequently, nightmares. The sleep problems compounded everything else. Increased anxiety, increased depression, decreased ability to cope. Some veterans developed dependence on alcohol to sleep, to quiet the mind, to escape the memories temporarily. The alcohol helped initially, provided relief, but created new problems: addiction, health problems, relationship problems. Relationships suffered under the weight of unexpressed trauma. Partners couldn't understand. The veteran couldn't explain. The distance grew. The veteran seemed different. Changed. Not the person who left for war. The personality was altered. The responses were different. The partner felt shut out. The veteran felt misunderstood. Some relationships survived, adapted, found ways to accommodate the changes. Others ended. Casualties of war that occurred years after combat ended. Employment was challenging for some veterans. The difficulty with authority, with routine, with meaninglessness. After flying combat missions, after facing death, after experiencing intensity that civilians never know. Civilian employment seemed trivial, seemed pointless. Some veterans adapted, found careers, found meaning. Others struggled, changed jobs frequently, never settled, searched for something that matched combat intensity. Rarely found it. The reunions with crew members became important. Annual gatherings, bomber group reunions, the chance to see the men you flew with, to talk with people who understood, who had been there, who knew without explanation. These reunions provided connection, provided validation, provided sense of belonging that civilian world couldn't match. The bonds formed in combat lasted lifetimes, lasted until death. Some veterans never attended reunions, never contacted crew members after war. The memories were too painful, the associations too strong. They wanted to leave the war behind, to move forward without looking back, to separate their current life from their combat experience. The strategy worked for some, allowed them to function, to build lives separate from the war. For others, the isolation made healing harder, made processing impossible. The question of how to remember arose, how to tell the story, whether to tell the story. Some veterans talked freely, shared experiences with families, with schools, with historians, wanted the story known, wanted younger generations to understand, wanted the sacrifice acknowledged. Other veterans never talked, kept the experience private, locked away, took it to their graves. Neither approach was wrong. Each veteran processed differently. Each decided individually what to share, what to keep private. The aircraft themselves became symbols. Museums preserved B-17s, restored them, displayed them. The sight of a B-17 triggered memories for veterans. Sometimes good memories. Pride in the aircraft, in what it accomplished, in what it meant. Sometimes difficult memories. Fear, loss, combat. The aircraft was reminder, was monument, was complicated symbol of complicated experience. The sound of radial engines affected some veterans. The distinctive sound, the rhythm, would hear it at air shows, at museums. The sound would trigger immediate response. Physical, emotional, heart rate would increase, breathing would quicken. The body would remember, would prepare for combat that wasn't coming. The response was automatic, was beyond control. Some veterans sought out the sound, found it comforting despite the anxiety, found connection to the past, to the crew, to the time when everything mattered intensely. The aging of veterans brought new challenges, health problems, mobility issues. The frostbite damage worsened with age. The hearing loss progressed. The psychological symptoms sometimes intensified or sometimes improved. The processing that took decades. The coming to terms with experience. The acceptance of what happened, what it meant. Some veterans found peace late in life, found ways to integrate the experience, to accept it, to live with it without being consumed by it. The final years brought reflection, looking back at youth, at the war, at what was done, what was survived, what was lost. Some veterans felt pride, had served, had done their duty, had contributed to victory. Others felt ambiguity, questioned whether it was worth the cost, whether the losses were justified, whether the damage was necessary. The questions had no clear answers, just personal reflection, personal conclusions. The death of crew members was felt by survivors. When word came that someone from the crew had died, a pilot, a gunner, a navigator, the connection was immediate. The grief was real. Even if they hadn't seen each other in decades, even if they hadn't stayed in touch. The crew bond persisted. Death of a crew member was personal loss, was reminder of mortality, was acknowledgement that the crew that flew together was diminishing, that eventually all would be gone. The legacy of B-17 crews is preserved in museums, in archives, in oral histories, in the stories told by families, in the recognition that what these men did was extraordinary, that the cost they paid was real, that their service mattered. The preservation of memory is important, not to glorify war, not to romanticize combat, but to remember, to understand, to acknowledge what was asked and what was given. The memorials exist throughout America and in England, in the towns where air bases were located, where the bombers flew from, where the missions began. The memorials list names, honor sacrifice, provide places for reflection, for remembrance. The visitors who come may not understand fully what these men experienced, may not grasp the cold or the fear or the endurance required. But the memorials provide connection, provide acknowledgement, provide space to honor service. The statistics remain. 47,000 men in B-17 crews, over 4,000 aircraft lost, tens of thousands of casualties. But behind each statistic was a person, a young man, early 20s mostly, with family, with hopes, with futures that were interrupted or ended by war. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. Each casualty was individual. Each loss was personal. Each survival was luck and skill combined. The men who flew in B-17s were not universal heroes, were not superhuman, were just young men doing what they were asked to do. Some were brave, some were terrified, but did it anyway. Some were skilled, some were adequate, some were lucky, some weren't, but all of them climbed into unpressurized bombers and flew to altitude where human life couldn't naturally exist. All of them endured cold that could kill. All of them breathed through oxygen masks for hours. All of them faced flak and fighters. All of them watched other bombers fall. All of them knew the statistics. All of them flew anyway. The recognition of their service is important not because they were exceptional humans, but because they were ordinary humans doing extraordinary things. Were teenagers and 20-year-olds making decisions about life and death. Were farm boys and city kids operating complex aircraft in combat. Were men who were scared but flew anyway, who were cold but endured, who were exhausted but continued. The ordinariness of who they were makes what they did more remarkable, not less. The lessons from their experience are multiple, about what humans can endure when required, about the cost of war measured not just in deaths but in lifelong injuries, about the importance of preparation and training, about the value of crew bonds and mutual dependence, about the role of luck in survival, about the complexity of combat where skill matters, but so does chance, about the lasting impact of trauma, about the need for support and understanding for those who serve. The question of whether the cost was justified remains debated, whether the strategic bombing campaign achieved results proportional to casualties, whether the losses were necessary, whether different tactics would have been better. These are questions for historians, for strategists, for those analyzing the war. The crews didn't make these decisions, didn't set policy, just executed missions, just did what was asked. The justification or lack thereof is separate from the acknowledgement of what these men experienced, what they endured, what they sacrificed. The comparison to other military roles is inevitable but not always useful. Infantry suffered terrible casualties. So did submariners, so did many roles. The suffering is not competition, is not comparative. Each role had its dangers, its costs, its requirements. The B-17 crews faced specific dangers at specific times in specific ways. Understanding those specifics doesn't diminish other experiences, just clarifies this one. The survivors who remained carried the weight forward, through decades, through all the years after the war, the weight of memory, the weight of survival when others didn't, the weight of what was seen, what was done, what was endured. Some carried it well, integrated it into full lives, others struggled, carried it heavily, but all carried it, because that's what survival meant, going forward with the experience, with the memories, with the knowledge of what happened at 25,000 feet in an unpressurized bomber over Germany in 1943 and 44 and 45. The gratitude for their service is genuine, is deserved. But gratitude alone doesn't erase the cost, doesn't remove the burden, doesn't heal the trauma. The recognition matters, the acknowledgement matters, but it doesn't change what happened, doesn't undo the damage, doesn't bring back the dead. Just provides context, provides understanding, provides appreciation for what was given. The final B-17 crew members are aging now, passing away. The direct connection to that experience is diminishing. Within years, within a generation, all will be gone. The living memory will end. Only recorded history will remain. Only documents and films and oral histories preserved. The urgency to capture their stories while possible is real, to record their experiences, to preserve their voices, to ensure that future generations can access not just facts, but perspectives. Not just statistics, but human experiences. What remained after was lives lived with the weight of having been B-17 crew members. Lives shaped by that experience. Lives marked by it. Some veterans integrated the experience successfully. Found careers, raised families, built futures. The war was part of their past, but not their entire identity. Others struggled more. The war defined them, defined their lives, prevented full engagement with the present because the past remained too vivid, too present. But all of them, successful integration or lifelong struggle, carried the knowledge of what it meant to climb into a B-17, to fly at altitude, to face the cold and the thin air and the flak and the fighters, to watch other bombers fall, to count parachutes, to endure 8-hour missions that tested human limits. To do this repeatedly, 25 times, 30 times, 35 times, to survive through combination of skill and luck, to carry the memories forward, to live with the tinnitus and the nightmares and the hypervigilance and all the ways that combat marks those who experience it. The story of B-17 crews is not simple, is not just heroism, is not just tragedy, is complex, is human, is about young men facing impossible situations, making difficult choices, enduring terrible conditions, surviving or not surviving based on factors often beyond their control, carrying the experience forward if they survived, being remembered by others if they didn't. The complexity deserves acknowledgement, the nuance deserves recognition, the full story, not simplified, not romanticized, but complete. That's what remained, that's what remains. The memory, the record, The understanding that what happened in the sky over Europe was terrible and necessary and costly and real, and that the men who experienced it deserved to be remembered not as statistics or symbols, but as humans who did what was asked of them under conditions that tested every limit, who paid prices that lasted lifetimes, who served when their country asked them to serve, who climbed into the bombers knowing the risks, who flew anyway, who endured what few humans are asked to endure, who were B-17 crew members during World War II. The engines are silent now. The missions are history. The men who flew them are aging or gone. But the story remains. The understanding of what it meant to fly in a B-17. What it cost, what it required. We remember not to glorify, not to make war seem noble or simple, but to understand, to acknowledge what these young men experienced, what they endured, what they gave. The cold at altitude that could kill, the oxygen masks that had to work perfectly, the flak fields they flew through, the fighters that attacked, the bombers that fell, the counting of parachutes, the endurance of 8-hour missions repeated dozens of times, the statistics that said survival was unlikely, the luck and skill required to beat those statistics. For those who survived, the war didn't end in May 1945. It continued in memories, in nightmares, in tinnitus that never stopped, in frostbite damage that never healed, in hypervigilance that never fully relaxed. The cost of service measured not just in combat casualties, but in decades of aftermath, in years of struggling with experiences that resisted integration, that changed who they were permanently. For those who didn't survive, the story ends at altitude, in the bomber, in the flash of flak, in the moment of fighter attack, in the oxygen failure that came silently, in the systems that failed, in the cold that killed. They remain forever young, forever at their positions, forever crew members on missions that never ended for them. The B-17 Flying Fortress flies still in museums, in air shows. Preserved examples of the aircraft that defined the bombing campaign, the sight of them, the sound of their engines, connects past to present, reminds us of what happened, of what was done, of what was given. The aircraft outlasted many of the men who flew them, survives as monument, as reminder, as teaching tool for generations who never knew war. Rest now. The story has been told. The missions have been described. The experience has been shared as much as words allow. The men who flew in B-17s served with courage that was sustained over time. Not momentary bravery, but endurance over missions that accumulated, over tours that tested human limits. They flew knowing the dangers, knowing the statistics. Flew anyway because that was what was asked, what was required, what duty meant. The rotors are silent. The altitude is reached only by memory now. The cold exists only in recollection, but the service was real, the sacrifice was real, the cost was real, and the story deserves to be told. Quietly, carefully, with respect for those who lived it, who died in it, who carried it forward. The men who climbed into the flying fortress, who faced the hell inside at 25,000 feet, who served, who endured, who are remembered. Sleep well, the missions are complete. The crews are at rest, their service is honored, their story is preserved. For those who came home and those who didn't, for all who flew in the B-17 and the flying fortress that demanded everything, that took so much, that these young men gave willingly, in service to their country, in service to their crews, in service to something larger than themselves. They flew, they fought, they endured, and they are remembered.